Brandon Sanderson's debut novel, the first story in the Cosmere, yet the lowest rated story in the Cosmere? Let's talk about it. Welcome back to the Pop Docs channel. My name is Joseph, one half of the Pop Docs, jumping back into the Cosmere to discuss the first of the Cosmere novels. That would be Elantris. And there it is. This is the Dragonsteel leatherbound edition, a beautiful edition of Elantris. And as I mentioned in the opening, this is, according to Goodreads, the lowest rated story in the Cosmere, looking solely at the novels in the Cosmere, not looking at the short stories or the novellas or the graphic novels. Nevertheless, that lowest rated aspect of Elantris is still very much a good rating for Elantris. I believe it's at a 4.13 on Goodreads right now, which is still an incredible rating for, especially for the debut novel and the beginning of the Cosmere. But I want to talk through not only Elantris in this particular video, but over a series of videos going through the Cosmere writ large. And in fact, I've done on this channel a few reviews of other aspects of the Cosmere that you can check out if you are interested. I love the Cosmere. For those uninitiated, the Cosmere is Mr. Sanderson's fictional universe in which many of his stories occur. Although they often occur on different planets with different societies, different peoples, different plot lines, different magic systems, that over time as the Cosmere has expanded in his canon, in his writings, in his work, there's starting to be more interconnected stories, interconnected plot lines, magic systems, and the like, that there are characters that can move from one series, one story to another by hopping planets in different ways. Won't go into any more detail because I do want to keep my discussions and my thoughts on the Cosmere novels and the Cosmere stories non-spoilery. In this particular video, as I mentioned, I want to talk about the beginning of the Cosmere, the first story in the Cosmere, which is Elantris. And what is Elantris? Let's look and read through the summary of this particular Cosmere story. Elantris was the capital of Arlon, gigantic, beautiful, literally radiant, filled with benevolent beings who used their powerful magical abilities for the benefit of all. Yet each of these demigods was once an ordinary person until touched by the mysterious transforming power of the Shroud. 10 years ago, without warning, the magic failed. Elantrians became wizened, leper-like, powerless creatures, and Elantris itself, dark, filthy, and crumbling. Arlon's new capital K crouches in the shadow of Elantris. Princess Serene of Teod arrives for a marriage of state with Crown Prince Raoden, hoping, based on their correspondence, to also find love. She finds instead that Raoden has died, and she is considered his widow. Both Teod and Arlon are under threat as the last remaining holdouts against the imperial ambitions of the ruthless, religious fanatics of Fjordo. So Serene decides to use her new status to counter the machinations of Raoden, a Fjordal high priest who has come to K to convert Arlon and claim it for his emperor and his god. But neither Serene nor Raoden suspect the truth about Prince Raoden. Stricken by the same curse that ruined Elantris, Raoden was secretly exiled by his father to the Dark City. His struggle to help the wretches trapped there begins a series of events that will bring hope to Arlon and perhaps reveal the secret of Elantris itself. Before jumping into my yays and my nays, what worked for me, what didn't work for me in Elantris, I do want to begin by briefly commenting on that general synopsis of the story. And as implicit in that 3-paragraph description of this story, there really are two different storylines going on here, following 3 characters generally. In fact, we get 3 point-of-view characters in this particular story. The first being Prince Raoden and his time in Elantris, this formerly magical city that has now descended into ruin and has become decrepit for some unknown, mysterious reason. And its own kind of corruption plagues those that would otherwise have been these magical beings that resided in Elantris and were able to utilize the magic of this particular world, this world in the Cosmere being Cell. That particular storyline plays out almost like a CSI type of story. It's all about the mystery of what happened to Elantris. And yes, there are some machinations involving different sects or different groups that have emerged in Elantris, filled by these Elantrians. And Prince Raoden not only has to navigate those particular types of dynamics, but also try to discover what happened to Elantris, putatively to try and figure out a way to reverse it or address it or heal it in some particular way. Very different, in my opinion, storyline, feel, theme, tone than what's going on with Serene and Rathen outside of Elantris, which is very much kind of a Games of Thrones type of story. A lot of political machinations as Serene is trying to counter Rathen's moves, as Rathen is trying to, as the synopsis suggests, convert this particular area on Cell, this particular kingdom on Cell, to Rathen's religion, thereby then also bringing them into the Imperial fold. And so we have these two very seemingly different, and I think they do feel very different while reading them, storylines going on throughout Elantris. And so that's really the framework and how I thought about Elantris, because I really liked, as we'll see here in a few moments, the storyline following Serene and Rathen and their navigation through court politics, their efforts to try to defeat the other in trying to fight for the soul of Arlon. Conversely, as we'll see in a few moments, I wasn't as interested in the exploits of Raoden and his efforts to try to uncover what happened in Elantris. But let's get into my yays for this particular story. And as I mentioned, the first one is the interplay, the interactions, the machinations of Serene and Rathen. These were definitely my two favorite characters in this particular story. And I love, in particular, how both are outsiders to this kingdom and therefore are somewhat removed from the politics from this kingdom, but also for different reasons they feel compelled to fight for the future of this particular kingdom. And so seeing those different dynamics playing out, seeing how each of them sees each other as potential adversaries in this fight for the soul of Arlon, and then how they go about countering one another, trying to achieve their goals, the strategies that they decide to employ in and of themselves, but also in reaction to what the other is doing. I loved all of the interplay between those two characters, and they ultimately were the two best characters for me in the story. Speaking specifically about Rathen, I thought his arc was really interesting, and how he really flies into Arlon as this high priest of this particular religious order that is the crux or the crucible around which this imperial kingdom exists and operates, and how he has to square his own religious beliefs with the goals and tasks that were set before him by the leaders of this particular imperial stronghold, and how that potential dissonance plays out in the psyche and the actions of Rathen. And so I really did enjoy it. I thought one of the highlights of Elantris was the point of view chapters of Rathen, as we see how he handles this, the internal dialogue and discourse he has with himself, involving these essentially two different aspects of his charge, and how that ultimately shapes his character throughout this particular story. And so I really thought a highlight of this particular novel were the chapters devoted to thinking through and following Rathen and his point of view. I actually really do like the magic system. I think it's an interesting take of a story about how magic has been corrupted, and then the rediscovery of the magic, the healing of the particular magic system. But ultimately, I really like the magic system and how it's centered around art and writing, and that it's these types of activities, these types of actions that essentially are the conduit through which the magic on this world emerges. And in fact, just kind of parenthetically, one of the great short stories in the Cosmere is The Emperor's Soul, which takes place on this same world. And you see echoes in that short story with Elantris. And so a lot of great things have emerged out of Elantris, besides simply the creation, the generation, the origin in many ways of the Cosmere. But that was one of the other highlights for me, was the magic system. And so at least to that small degree, that was the thing that interested me the most in Raoden's storyline, even though I still think Raoden was, if I had to rank the POV characters, the third best POV character, definitely superseded by Serene and Rathen. Turning to my nays, I really thought the pacing was difficult. This was very much, in my opinion, a very, very slow burn in both storylines. And yes, we get the Sanderlanche, as it's sometimes called, at the end of Elantris. Although I've always thought that a lot of his endings that have been characterized by the fans as a Sanderlanche is more of a Sander Kano, because you can definitely see from the outset how he starts the pressure building, and then throughout the story that pressure continues to build and build and build until ultimately erupts into madness and chaos. And certainly you get that in this particular story. I just thought the first 2/3 of the story were very slowly paced, and so it did take me a little while to get into the story, into the flow of the story. And then once we got to the Sander Kano, the Sanderlanche, it was too chaotic, and I felt too rushed. And also, it takes place largely in an area we've only heard about and haven't actually experienced in the story. And so I felt very much removed in many ways from the larger story that we had been reading in the end. And so this is one of my big nays. What really didn't work for me was the pacing in all these different dimensions. Part of that might have been facilitated, and I think it was facilitated by the fact that we do have, in my opinion, two very divergent stories for much of Elantris. This CSI dynamic with Prince Raoden and the Game of Thrones dynamic with Serene and Rathen. And you're interspersing each of these different storylines as you go along, even though there's really no connective tissue until the third act of this particular novel. So that disjointedness really pulled me out in different places when I was wrenched from one type of story to the other with different themes and tropes, characters, goals, interests, etc., etc. And so ultimately, although they do come together, for most of the novel, it was really a struggle for me going back and forth between these two disjointed storylines. And then lastly, again, just going back to the pacing, the third act, I thought, while action-packed, and it did bring together the different storylines in interesting ways, for the reasons I mentioned a few moments ago, it didn't work for me as well as several of the other endings in Mr. Sanderson's Cosmere works. Looking at You, Words of Radiance, one of my favorite endings to a Cosmere novel. So those are just some of the nays that I had, the things that didn't work for me in this particular novel. So let me then turn now to my rating and my final thoughts. This actually is not my least favorite Cosmere novel. Another way to put that is I would not rate this the lowest of the Cosmere novels, as it finds itself on Goodreads. And again, as I mentioned at the outset, even though it is the lowest rated Cosmere novel on Goodreads, its rating is still really good. And so even if it is the lowest rated Cosmere novel relative to other stories, other novels, this is still a really highly rated novel. And I would also say I really did enjoy this, as I enjoy all that emerges in the Cosmere, but certainly relative to one another, there are some stories I enjoy more, some Cosmere stories I would revisit more often than others. And so for me, certainly Elantris is not personally the lowest rated, the least interesting Cosmere novel for me. I'd say it's somewhere in the middle tier to potentially the lower tier. In fact, just to kind of give some sense of where I would put this, there are some of the stories in Mistborn Era 2 that I would rate lower, or I enjoyed less than Elantris. Ultimately, I gave this an 8 out of 10, this particular story, for the various reasons that I mentioned. Thought about going a little lower solely because I wasn't as enamored with Raoden's storyline throughout much of the novel, although I think he ultimately does get a really interesting and fun ending in this particular story, an earned ending in this particular story. But so much of the novel, 2/3 of the novel with his storyline, just I struggled with. But it was counterbalanced in so many ways by the stories of Serene and Rathan. So there's my rating. There are my final thoughts. I certainly recommend to Cosmere fans who have probably already read Elantris, but also to those thinking about jumping into the Cosmere, although this is not the first Cosmere novel I would recommend for newbies to the Cosmere. This is certainly, I think, a fun read to pick up in your downtime. And although at the moment it's a standalone story, there have been statements made by Mr. Sanderson that he's intending to write more stories in the realm of Elantris. And I actually am looking forward to any of those sequels that may come out in the future. Before closing with my final thoughts on Elantris, I did want to briefly mention a spoilery element to Elantris and the larger Cosmere. So, for those concerned in any way about spoilers, major or minor, please go ahead and jump off the video here. Come back after you've read through the Cosmere to hear these final thoughts of mine on Elantris. So, major, minor spoilers, not really sure where they fall. Elantris, particularly Elantrians, seem to be incredibly important to the larger Cosmere. And this is not the only time we've seen Elantrians. We've seen Elantrians emerge, pop up in several other places, several other stories in the Cosmere. Thinking of Secret History, Mistborn Secret History, Mistborn, The Lost Metal from Era 2. Most recently, seemingly, there was an Elantrian in Trusts of the Emerald Sea. And the way that they're depicted, in my own personal view, is that Mr. Sanderson seems to be suggesting, at least that there are sects or individuals within Elantris or from Elantris that might have aims and goals that are self-centered, might be detrimental to other worlds in the Cosmere, other peoples, other societies in the Cosmere. Looking at you, Trust of the Emerald Sea. And so I am really interested in delving back into, at some point, what happened with Elantrians, what's been going on in Elantris following this particular novel, particularly given its situation, its placement in the timeline of the Cosmere. And for all of those reasons, because it seems like Elantrians have a key role to play in the larger Cosmere, which is one of my favorite aspects of these stories that Mr. Sanderson has penned, is the larger Cosmere, the world building that he has put into his Cosmere. And so I really am hungering for more stories from Cell, more stories following from Elantris to see how we've gone from what happened in Elantris to where we are now with the particular Cosmere. And so over time, as Elantrians continue to emerge, continue to show up in later Cosmere novels, that's actually only increased my love of Elantris, my interest in Elantris, and my hope that those sequels to Elantris come soon from Mr. Sanderson. If you like book reviews, if you like talking pop culture, if you like to react to television shows, films, talk about pop culture conventions, please think about subscribing to our channel, watching other videos on this channel, liking those other videos on this channel, because we will continue to talk about pop culture in all of its different manifestations, giving our own thoughts and opinions on these different aspects of popular culture. But with that, the Pop Docs Clinic for this video is officially closed.